Good evening. I am Ilani Casey. I am the interim executive director of the Nakani Native Program. Let me tell you a little bit about our program. We are a 501c3 in Seattle. Our mission is to provide social and political support to Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest, expressing values of simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equity. Our vision is to have powerful Indigenous peoples lead the world in protecting Mother Earth like we've always done since time immemorial. And I will do a brief welcoming song to help ground us, and then a very brief land acknowledgement. And then Lindsey will talk a little bit about our traditional medicine program. So thank you so much for your patience. Way, 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 hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, hey. Way, hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, hey. Way, hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, hey. Way, hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, 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 hey. Way, hey. Way, hey. Ganesh. I will do a brief welcoming land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their resilience and energy to making the history that led to this moment right now. We recognize the people who were marginalized but refused to be non-existent. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We want to respectfully acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples, whose ancestors and descendants have stewarded this land and water since time immemorial. We pay respects to their elders, my elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Please acknowledge and honor and respect the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Snoqualmie, the Muckleshoot, and the Tulalip. Oho, Ganeshtish, oho. And now I give you Lindsey Crowfoot.
I can unmute myself there. Hi there. Hi, my name is Lindsey Crowfoot. I'm a member of the Tlingit Nation. I am Hutsnuwukwan Deshi Tan. I'm from the Fortress of the Brown Bear Tribe, from the Beaver Clan. I'm Raven Beaver on my mother's side. On my father's side, I'm Colville Okanagan Samquel descendant. I'm the Traditional Medicine Program Director for the Nakani Native Program. And I'm also the Cultural Sovereignty and Natural Sciences instructor at Northwest Indian College on the Tulalip Reservation. I wanted to just tell you briefly about what we are doing here with the Nakani Traditional Medicine Program. Our Traditional Medicine Program work is centered around building a sense of belonging within the local tribal community by reconnecting with our traditional lifeways. Our program focuses on increasing the health, vitality, and community connection of the local urban Native community by increasing access to traditional foods, medicines, natural resources, traditional knowledge, and culturally relevant educational experiences. And in line with that, we're really excited to have here tonight with us Camie Goldhammer sharing her presentation on reclaiming the tradition of breastfeeding. Camie, if you wanted to jump in, you could introduce yourself and then move into your presentation. I wanted to let everybody know first, though, that Tana, who is our traditional medicine program assistant, and I will be moderating the chat. If you have any questions, you can put those into the chat. And then when Camie asks us to either read those to her or open up the chat for her to read, to respond to, we'll do that. And then we will, I guess, check back in at the end or whenever Camie wants us to kind of interact in that way. So thanks, Camie.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me see. All right. I'm unmuted. My video's on. Great. Well, hate tu ashte mi takiapi, peti de chante washtea nape chusa pa, Camie Goldhammer makiapi, damakota sisituan wapetuan hamacha, duamish makocha edwati. So good evening, my relatives. I come to you with an open heart and hands tonight. My name's Camie. I am Dakota, my tribe is Sisseton Wahpeton, and I live in South Seattle in Duwamish territory. So I'm really grateful to be with you all today. Thank you for sticking around through our little technical difficulties and this change of Zooms. So I am really excited to talk to you all about breastfeeding tonight. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. I don't know how well I'll do at staying on it, but we'll do our best. Perfect. Hopefully, I'm like, let's see, I can see Lindsey and Tana. Does that look okay to you both? Okay, cool. Well, I also know we have kind of a more intimate group. And so I would love to, if you wanted to, just put in the chat like who you are, and why you chose to be here tonight, kind of your interest in this topic, and that might help me a little bit too with our discussion. But I am a clinical social worker and a lactation consultant and a full spectrum Indigenous doula. I came into the field of breastfeeding several years ago, when I had my first daughter in 2009. Prior to that, I was working as a social worker, a clinical social worker, a therapist for the Snoqualmie tribe. And as a social worker, my area of expertise is the impacts of historical and intergenerational trauma on attachment and bonding and parenting practices in the Native community. And so that was a bulk of my work, was working with families to reconnect with their children, get their children back if they were in care, or prevent removal for kids that families that were really close or are on that cusp of losing their kiddos. And then when I became, when I got pregnant and with my first daughter and delivered her and decided at the hospital to breastfeed her because I had never seen it or heard of it. Like I had no prior knowledge of breastfeeding. I had not made a decision to breastfeed at all before I had her. I had a very kind of life-changing experience when I nursed her for the first time, and that's kind of where we've gotten to today. So I've spent the last almost 13 years really focused on birth and breastfeeding reclamation in Indigenous communities and our Native communities, rematriation and connecting more with our birth traditions and practices. In my day job here in Seattle, I run Hummingbird Indigenous Family Services, which is a newer organization with a more established program. One of our programs is Hummingbird Indigenous Doulas. We were previously at another org under a different name and decided a couple, just about just over a half a year ago, actually, to move away from that org and start something different. And so our program has been around for several years at this point, but it's kind of new within the Hummingbird structure. We have another program called that is a pilot program for guaranteed basic income, which we're hoping to launch in the spring. And that program will provide Indigenous pregnant people with guaranteed income for from the time they come into the program, probably sometime after the early second trimester, until their child's second birthday. And so we're really excited about that program, and we'll be launching that hopefully in August or September. But our doula program, Hummingbird Indigenous Doulas, provides full spectrum doula support to families in the King County area. We have a little bit of funding to help support families outside of King County on a case-by-case basis, but a full spectrum doula, or I want to explain a little bit about what a full spectrum doula is. So we provide, well, we kind of fulfill that auntie role, I'd say, in a traditional, traditional sense of the word when we think about what our births would have been like, our postpartum ceremony would have been like. We would have been, surrounded by our relatives and taken care of during that postpartum ceremony and that transition to becoming parents. And so that's what we do now. So we provide continuous emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental support to people in the perinatal period. So we, and that's what full spectrum means, is we, while a bulk of our families come to us for labor and delivery and postpartum support, we have a lot of families that also come to us because they're trying to conceive and on that journey to becoming parents. We support people who are terminating pregnancies and feel really strongly about supporting Indigenous sovereignty, body sovereignty, and supporting people's access to terminating pregnancies and having children when they want to have children. We support people through pregnancy losses as well. But again, most of our families come to us for labor and delivery and postpartum support. So I did put up on the very last slide, I do have my kind of like personal contact information and my Hummingbird information if that was relevant to anybody here. So I think with that, I'm gonna just jump right in. I know we have until about 7:30 and I would love to be able to take any questions and things like that. Lindsey and Tina, I really am okay with like questions kind of going, especially like with a smaller group. I don't mind if people unmute and ask a clarifying question, or if you do want to put it in the chat, that's okay too. Or if you have a story or an example that you feel is relevant or you want to share, I welcome that. But I will try and leave time at the end also for questions if there is anything there or comments. But I don't mind. I don't think of it as interruptions. So just ask away.
Okay.
There is pretty much no guarantee. I will just put it out there right now. There's no way I'll get all this in the time we have. So just, do what we're going to do what we can. So yeah. Okay. So I want to start out with just this quote. Actually, I'm going to start out with something different. Let me go back to my first slide. So I want to, sorry, when I moved that, I moved where you all are pictured in here. Okay. So before we jump into this, I really want to lay out a couple of kind of like foundational beliefs and explain the lens that I'm coming from. So typically when we talk about things like breastfeeding, or you will also see me use the term chest feeding throughout this presentation, which really acknowledges and is a more inclusive term for feeding our milk medicine to our babies. And I'll interchange those words or use both words, breastfeeding and chest feeding, but it's a more inclusive term again for our two-spirit relatives who maybe don't identify as as women don't identify their body parts as breasts. Also, we have a lot of families that pump, are unable to feed directly from their body, mix feed, things like that. And so may not identify strongly with the word breastfeeding. So I just want to acknowledge that. But one of the things that I really want to point out is just in this slide, reclaiming the tradition of breastfeeding, right? So I am not going to be speaking from a lens that is the mainstream society talks about breastfeeding as a feeding choice, right? One of two ways to feed a baby. I will be talking about breastfeeding as a cultural and a traditional practice, because that's what it is. When we look at communities across the world who have maintained the tradition of breastfeeding, so there's very few of them, and they are, the ones that do exist are indigenous communities that have been largely untouched by European and American societies. I mean, that's just bottom line, what it is. And so what we know, sorry, I am on call for a birth. So my phone just rang. It wasn't the mama, so I'm going to just ignore it. But I did want to say that to her. Like, I'm on call for a birth, and her last birth was really fast. So I actually really do need to answer the phone if she calls. So anyhow, when we look at those communities that have maintained the tradition of breastfeeding, they have all the same problems that we have here in America, right? Or in the United States. They worry about making enough milk. They worry if their milk is good enough, if their diet is good enough to make good milk. They have sore nipples. They get infections. They get milk blisters and clogged ducts, mastitis, like all the things, like they experience all of these things. And even in nature, we see this. Many people are really surprised to learn that most of what lactation consultants know about breastfeeding, particularly solving breastfeeding problems, we've learned from the dairy industry. There's a lot more dollars when it comes to the dairy industry to solving lactation problems than there is in humans, right? And so a lot of what we know, especially when it comes to clogged ducts and mastitis, which is a breast infection, almost our entire protocol is what we learned from the dairy industry and how they treat those conditions. So they happen in nature too. So that's something that I really want to make sure folks understand, is that breastfeeding is not easy to everyone, right? Like everyone, animals, other people have challenges with it. So when we look at those communities that have maintained the tradition of breastfeeding, the one thing that they have that we don't necessarily have in our communities here on Turtle Island is grandmothers that breastfed, right? So they don't have that. They have that intergenerational knowledge that has been passed down. And that's what we mean by it's a tradition. It's a cultural practice. We would learn how to breastfeed in our traditional communities the same way we would learn how to dig out a canoe, the same way we would learn how to harvest nettle, the same way we would learn how to do the protocol at canoe journey landings, things like that, right? We learn it by being immersed in it. We learn it by watching it, right? I'm a star quilter, and my grandma was a star quilter, and I learned to quilt from her by sitting at her feet for most of my childhood, watching her quilt, watching her sew. And it was years until it was my turn to cut the fabric and my turn to sew. And even then I had to check every stitch with her, and she would give me it's good, Cam, go ahead. You can, keep sewing, or why don't you try again, right? And that would mean I'd rip out that seam or that stitch and try and do a little bit better. And so breastfeeding really, really is the same thing. We don't think of people as breastfeeding, it's cultures breastfeed, right? And this is a traditional practice that, as many of our traditional practices have been, that was stolen from us during colonization, right? And that was very systemic, that decision to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But that's really, one of the first things I wanted to lay out is I'm not talking about breastfeeding as a feeding choice. The food I say is bonus, like it's the bomb food, like it's the best thing on earth. You can't get better. There is not a more perfect food for us to eat and like any human to eat besides human milk. And that's bonus to all of the other things that it brings to us. So so that's what I wanted to lay out first. So now I can move forward. So this is a quote that I tend to start with, that I really, really love and kind of embodies what I love about breastfeeding. One of the many things that I love about breastfeeding, and I love breastfeeding, so I can talk about it a long time, which is why I know I won't be able to stick to an hour. But this is by James P. Grant. He's the former executive director of UNICEF. UNICEF is, I can't even think of the actual acronym. I know it's something like United, it's part of like an international organization on infants and children feeding program. So that's kind of what they focus on. But he says exclusive breastfeeding goes a long way toward canceling out the health difference between being born into poverty and being born into affluence. It is almost as if breastfeeding takes the infant out of poverty for those first few months in order to give the child a fair start to life and compensate for the injustice of the world into which it is born, right? And so I just like, when I saw this, I was like, yes, 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 yes. Of course, UNICEF, their focus is on the world and the most vulnerable populations in the world, who, quite frankly, babies die if they don't get human milk, right? And if we look at the health disparities, and we'll talk a little bit more about those, and the health outcomes of our indigenous people to Turtle Island, we tend to have equal or worse health outcomes than many communities throughout the developing world, right? So if we continue to center indigenous people and our Black relatives, our Black sisters and brothers, who also have, we tend to fight for the bottom in different areas, when it comes to health disparities and things like that. That if we here in the United States and Canada, on Turtle Island, really focused on our most vulnerable populations, which again is Black and Indigenous communities, there would be much more of an emphasis on the importance of breastfeeding, right? Because it is a life-saving medicine that is really important for our babies and our children and our adults and our elders. And we will talk about how we are impacted by the lack of human milk that we got as babies, right? And when we look at our health disparities. So because I know you all are not a breastfeeding group, this isn't a lactation, conference that I'm speaking at. I wanted to lay out a couple of just, kind of what are the recommendations, what does it mean, and what are our current rates when it comes to breastfeeding? So the World Health Organization, which again is another international public health organization, that again makes its recommendations based on the most vulnerable populations in the world, recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of their life, of a baby's life. Exclusive breastfeeding means that a baby gets nothing but human milk for the first 6 months of their life. So this can be directly from their parent, or it can be human milk from another parent, whether that's directly feeding from someone else, or pumped milk, right? So that's kind of what what they consider exclusive breastfeeding. So the baby's getting nothing but human milk for the first 6 months of their life. Nothing else will touch their mouth. Every other health organization in the world, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, also recommends exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of a baby's life. The World Health Organization says that they want babies to breastfeed for a minimum of 2 years, right? So a minimum of 2 years. And the American Academy of Pediatrics says a minimum of 1 year, which was largely based, again, on cultural practices and not really centering the most vulnerable communities in the US. But they say a minimum of 1 year. All other organizations say, or the thing I want to point out about this is that these are minimums, right? There is actually no upper limit as to when a child should stop breastfeeding. And there are only benefits to nursing the longer a child nurses. When we look at anthropological studies and look, at historical societies and look at other milk feeding mammals, it is estimated that the natural age of weaning for humans is between the age of 3 and 7 years old. So that tends to be when we lose our milk teeth, right? So just like animals, like they lose their milk teeth, and that's when they start that weaning process. So for puppies, that's, within about 2 to 3 months is when that starts to begin, that process begins. For some of our primate relatives, elephants nurse for years, for several years, but it's again estimated for humans that it's between 3 and 7 years. And what we know about brain development is this really backs that up. We know that for optimal brain development of a human baby, that they need 3 things, and that is fat, sleep, and love and affection, right? Those are the 3 things that they need for optimal brain development. And breastfeeding human milk facilitates all of these things. Our milk is super fatty. It's fattier than any other milk known to us, right? So it's way fatter than even like half and half or whipping cream. So it's got lots of really good, healthy fats for that baby whose brain, when they're born, they have about 25% of their brain capacity. And by the age of 3, their brain has grown to about 80% of its capacity. So this is why a high fat milk is so important for toddlers, right? Because their brain is still developing, but we've really normalized cow's milk after a certain age, but human milk would of course be the developmentally appropriate food for that time. So those are the recommendations. Again, there's no upper limit into how long a child should breastfeed. We have no research, absolutely zero research stating that it's harmful for an older baby or young child to breastfeed long term. There are only benefits associated with that. So where do we stand? Kind of like, what does this look like? So these are actually Washington state rates. I think most of us are probably from Washington state. There may be some of you that are from other parts of the country, but I chose Washington state's rates for this particular presentation. I also want to point out in this is that Washington state, we tend to fall in the top 5 best states for breastfeeding rates. So so we're like top 5, really, really great compared to the rest of the country breastfeeding rates. So that would be really disappointing, right? That we're still in the top 5 and look at how low those numbers are, but I'll explain what these mean. So initiation rate, and these are the rates of white folks and Native American, Alaska Native, First Nations people. So that's who's included in this one. This would be non-Hispanic Native American folks. So initiation rate is the word that we use in lactation to describe whether or not a child or a baby breastfeeds on the first day of their life. Okay, so that's the initiation rate. Did they breastfeed day 1? So this is the hospital rates. This is, tends to be the data that they're collecting. As you can see up here, about 9 out of 10 people choose to breastfeed when they have or white folks choose to breastfeed when they have their baby, right? Most are wanting to do that. For the Native community, about 7 in 10 of us are choosing to breastfeed. And this is a disparity. So this is when we talk about disparities, that's what this is referring to, is this gap, this 20% gap between white white parents and Native parents in their decision to breastfeed, okay? Here you see EBF, that means exclusive breastfeeding. So that means, back to this definition, that a baby's getting nothing but breast milk. So that's exclusive breastfeeding at 3 months. And remember, that's the recommendation, is that babies are exclusively breastfed to 6 months. So at 3 months, we are at about 50% of white parents are exclusively breastfeeding at 3 months. And about just over 20% of Native parents are exclusively breastfeeding at 3 months. And then we have 6 months, right? So we have another drastic drop right here, sharp drop, where about 20, it's like 25%. I can't see my notes with the way I'm sharing my slides. So about 25% of white parents are exclusively breastfeeding at 6 months, and 9.1% of Native parents are meeting this goal of exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life. And so this here is a really staggering drop and really concerning. And I always say, this is who we care about. This is, well, I care about all the babies, but this is the population that I serve, right? I'm not super interested in convincing people who don't want to breastfeed, right? Like that's not my soapbox that I'm going to stand on. I find that parents who make that decision have made very informed decisions based on their family and what they have access to and things like that. But the fact that 60% of families don't meet their breastfeeding goals, that's my focus, right? That's who I really want to make sure gets the support that they need. And then we have breastfeeding at 1 year. About 20% of Native families are breastfeeding at 1 year. Just under 40% of white families are breastfeeding at 1 year. The reason why this number is higher than this number is that we have families in this section that were not exclusively breastfeeding. So maybe they started supplementing with formula in this section, or maybe they started solids at 5 months instead of 6 months or something like that. And so they still are counted toward breastfeeding, but not this exclusive breastfeeding goal. So I hope that makes sense there. I'm going to pause. Are there any questions about what I've talked about so far, or anything?
They put their introductions in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, we got a couple of social workers and lots of medical students. It's so good to see you all. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, and there's a couple of people who haven't put in where they're from. Anthony and Sarah. It'd be great to hear from them in the chat.
You got called out by Auntie Ilani. All right. Awesome. Thank you. All right. It's great to have you all here.
Camie,
So, yeah.
I did have a question.
Sure.
Have a question. So why, I mean, I think you're probably going to go over this. What are the or maybe you won't, what are the percentages of people that are just breastfeeding, not exclusively breastfeeding, in those earlier months?
So maybe they're breastfeeding and offering bottle formula or something like that. Yeah. So it's about double. So I want to say, I mean, and I can definitely get these for you, but I want to say for 6 months, Native families that are still breastfeeding, but maybe offering formula as well, or started solids before 6 months, is about 20%. So each one's about double, if they're offering formula or some other food, besides breast milk.
Gotcha.
Yeah. All right, cool. So next I just wanted to kind of talk about what human milk does and why it's so important for Native communities, because that's, one thing that I hear a lot, and I see, I'm on a lot of lactation groups, is, and there's definitely a lot of, kind of debates about is breast milk that special, you know, like, is like, you know, I mean, I'll see a lot of times people say like, you know, there's nominal improvements, you know, for babies that are breastfed, things like that. And again, like, sure, if we center like upper middle class white people who have access to like all the things, like their babies tend to do okay, right? Like their babies tend to do okay whether they're breastfed or formula fed. But this is where those disparities really start to come to fruition, is when our babies, our Native babies, and our Black relatives, sisters and brothers, their babies can struggle a lot and are impacted disproportionately by the health impacts of not breastfeeding. So let's just talk a little bit about what human milk does. So, you know, kind of why is it so important to our Native community? So the first thing that I want to talk about is SIDS. SIDS, or SUID deaths, and sudden unexplained infant death syndrome. Here in Washington State, Native babies are about three times more likely to die of SIDS than non-Native babies or white babies. And it is an epidemic in Indigenous communities across the world. So actually, when we look at our relatives in Canada, our relatives in New Zealand and Australia, we actually are the ones with the highest SIDS rates, you know, like across the board. And so there's certainly like room for additional research there. And one of my friends, Melissa Bartik and Cecilia Tamori, who are, Melissa's a doctor and Cecilia's a doctorate of nursing, so a nurse doctor, have done some really good research into looking at the impacts of historical trauma and colonization on SIDS rates. And I'm really excited about that work to get more and more press. But what we see is that babies that aren't breastfed have a 50 to 70% increased risk of SIDS. And that's pretty significant. You know, it tends to not be on the list of ways to prevent SIDS. It might, you know, may eventually make the list, like on number 9 or 10, you know, of a list of 10 things that you can do. We tend to really focus on sleep and where a child sleeps and who they sleep with and things in their sleep environment, rather than what they're being fed. But there's a couple of things as to why we think breast milk or human milk, particularly breastfeeding, being breastfed, is protective against SIDS. So the first thing is that human milk is really easily digested. I already talked about how it's like the perfect food, right? It's super bomb. And it goes in and it very quickly and easily is digested and comes right back out. And so breastfed babies tend to be hungry very often, right? And that can often be a complaint of nursing parents or a frustration of nursing parents, and a slippery slope towards supplementing, right? Because they might be so tired because their baby wakes up so often. And then grandma says, give the baby some formula, they'll sleep longer, you know, or put some rice in their bottle, they'll sleep longer, things like that. And what I like to remind parents is that waking up is a life-saving skill for a baby. Right? Waking up is a life-saving skill for a baby. And we really need to like stop kind of like glorifying sleeping all night for babies and really glorifying the fact that our babies remember to wake up and breathe. Right? That's really what we want babies to be doing. And so human milk really facilitates that, right? Because it comes in, they sleep, and it's digested really quickly and easily. And an hour and a half later, they wake up, or 2 hours later, they wake up, or 4 hours later, they wake up, right? Like that's kind of how it is. And so that's one thing that we see, right? Is that babies are just, they just wake up more. But that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? The other thing is that we, know, and a lot of times, like if we had more time, and, Tana's done my Indigenous breastfeeding counselor training, but one of the things, like when we do this, is I survey the audience of what you know about breastfeeding, and usually someone will say like, breastfeeding's healthier, right? Or it's better for your health. And we talk about how human milk is filled with antibodies. It's a living substance, right? It's filled with antibodies and white blood cells. And it we as nursing parents take in so much data about our environment that we're in, the germs and the viruses that our children are exposed to. And we start making antibodies against those illnesses within 2 hours of exposure. So within 2 hours of a child being exposed to an illness, like, for example, COVID, right, which is one that we're all very much coming into, have been very immersed in the last 2 years, that parent will start making antibodies against COVID within 2 hours of exposure and giving those antibodies to the baby, right? And this is why breastfed babies don't get as sick as often. And if they do get sick, because they're still kids and kids get sick, they tend to get better faster, and those illnesses aren't as severe, right? So a lot of times they don't experience dehydration, things like that, or maybe not able to keep anything down except for human milk, things like that. So what we know about SIDS too is that a lot more kids do have access, who die of SIDS or SID deaths, tend to have like some underlying respiratory infections that maybe were known about, maybe weren't known about, but breast milk is just really protective, especially against respiratory infections. And so that's another area that we know that breast milk is really protective against SIDS. The other thing is that typically for breastfeeding to be successful, that parent needs to sleep with their kid or near their kid, right? So very rarely is breastfeeding going to be super successful if the baby's down the hallway in another room, right? Chances are we're sleeping in the same room as our child at the very least, and there's plenty of research to back up the importance of co-sleeping, so sleeping in the same room, and it's protective. It's how protective it is against SIDS. But a lot of breastfeeding parents also bed share and sleep really close to their baby too. And so, because of that, we tend to be on it, right? Like our baby's breath is regulated because they're kind of come in line with our breathing. And if they stop or there's a pause in their breath, a nursing parent tends to wake up, right? And kind of rouses the baby and knows that something is going on. So that's another area that we see it as being really protective, is just the parent and the baby are super close to each other and really connected. We see an increased risk of type 1 and type 2 diabetes in babies that aren't breastfed, and an increased risk of type 2 diabetes in parents that don't breastfeed. This is particularly important for our Indigenous communities. Up to 30% of Native adults are diabetic. It's the 4th leading cause of death of Native people in the United States. We have some tribal communities where 60%, 2/3 of the adult population are diabetic, right? So it's an epidemic in our communities, and breastfeeding is extremely protective against diabetes. So we see that babies that are breastfed have a 40 to 90% reduced risk of developing diabetes and heart disease. And for parents that are parents that have gestational diabetes, which is a type of diabetes that some people get in pregnancy, but that increases their risk of type 2 diabetes, that when they breastfeed, that their risk of developing type 2 diabetes is decreased significantly as well. So there's a lot of protections there. And throughout Indian country, most breastfeeding work that's being done by tribes and whatnot is being done with diabetes prevention dollars, right? So it's not food sovereignty dollars. It's not like anything like that. It's diabetes prevention dollars that are focusing on breastfeeding as preventative, because they know, and the research is so clear about how protective it is. So again, a really great example of something that disproportionately impacts Native people. But when we, don't talk about how important breastfeeding is for it, this contributes to our illness and our premature death. Okay? We see an increased risk of dying from complications related to being born low birth weight, that's this LBW, and or premature. So this is specifically referring to a gastrointestinal infection, bacterial infection called necrotizing enterocolitis. This is one of the leading causes of death of babies that are born premature. So it's a bacterial infection of the gut. And the risk factors for NEC, NEC is the shortened kind of acronym version of it, of necrotizing enterocolitis. So the risk factors for being born for NEC is being born premature and formula fed, right? So it is almost non-existent in babies that are breastfed. And in fact, when babies have NEC, it is absolutely essential that they get human milk and they discontinue the use of formula. And so there's a lot of information out there on this, but this is something too that native babies are more likely to be born premature and low birth weight, right? Our parents, due to weathering and systemic racism and oppression, are more likely to deliver prematurely. And so this is something that our babies are at heightened risk for. And then if you go back to our breastfeeding rates, we have the lowest breastfeeding rates, which increases our baby's risk of dying of this condition. So something that's really important for our communities. We see an increased risk of heart disease for both babies and parents, as well as several cancers. And then for parents, we have an increased risk of perinatal mood disorders. This is something that I should maybe put like a little asterisk on there, because I do want to point out that that breastfeeding, when it's going well, is protective against perinatal mood disorders. When breastfeeding is not going well, it's a risk factor. Okay, so if it's hard and the parent is not getting the support they need, then they're at increased risk of a perinatal mood disorder, which is why providing support to a parent to meet their breastfeeding goals and for breastfeeding to be successful is really, really, really important for them, right? And then so I think those are the main things I wanted to talk about as far as like what's important for our communities. Excuse me. This is just a little project that I did when I was in Browning, Montana a couple years ago, doing a breastfeeding training, where we did, a medicine wheel, because a lot of times you hear things like, what are the benefits of breastfeeding, right? And I don't like to talk about benefits. You'll kind of see this language here too, is babies that are not breastfeed, right? 70% increased risk of SIDS. Parents that do not breastfeed, increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, because human milk breastfeeding is our biological norm, right? So there really isn't, it's like saying that there's a benefit to breathing, right? Or a benefit to our blood circulating throughout our body. That is just like the standard, the biological norm, right? That is how it should be, and all things should be compared to that, right? And so there's not really a benefit to breastfeeding, it's just how it should be. So there's risks associated with not breastfeeding. And that's kind of like the language that we want to I try not to use. It's still really easy to slip into like, talking about benefits, but it really does kind of then normalize, it makes diabetes normal, right? That's normal. And we all know that is not Creator did not give us our food and our physical activities that we did traditionally and to where we would develop diabetes, right? Like that is not how it would be. Our earth was designed to keep us healthy and give us good food and energy sources. And it's been, there's a risk associated with not eating a traditional foods diet, right? And that's where we're really seeing the massive increase in diabetes rates over the last several decades, century probably. So when I was doing this project in Blackfeet, we did the medicine wheel, which for many of you know, is we have our, the medicine wheel is our symbol for many tribes in the US, including mine, of holistic health and well-being, right? It symbolizes balance. And specifically, we have our mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional health, right? And that all four of those things need to be cared for and nurtured and in balance for a person to be healthy, right? For their to have that whole body health. So we kind of talked about, had people put on here kind of what's important for breastfeeding, right? So how is breastfeeding important for our mental health? How is breastfeeding important for our physical health, our spiritual health, our emotional health? And you might be able, I'll get like really close and dorky as I read some of these, but I'm looking up here at the yellows, so this is, we have wards off depression and mama, attachment, overwhelming joy, happy feelings, right? So these are emotional reasons. Serenity, I love that. Cost effective, right? So that cost effective piece. And so they're not stressing about money. It's not something that they have to stress about, that kind of stuff. Mothers feel a sense of love, right? Close bonding. So we have lots of great things. And then we have here, like, this is, I think, our mental health. So secure babies, calm, higher IQ, trust, right? Here we have like weight management, less dental cavities, which is true, digestion, metabolism, less ear infections, right? Less menstrual cycles. That's something that happens too usually. So this is that physical health. And then this section is our spiritual health, which I can't read all of those, but I typically have notes, again, that I can't see right now, but, it was like Creator gave us this milk to give to our baby, connecting with your ancestors, by, nursing your baby, passing on your traditional stories through nursing and that genetic knowledge, right, that's carried through our milk. A lot of Native communities or Indigenous communities have teachings around the stories that our milk carries and feeds to our baby. So those are just some of the things. And I just love the way this ended up looking, and they ended up like laminating it and hanging it in the hospital and stuff, but really speaks to, again, that this just isn't a feeding choice, right? There's so much more that goes into it, and breastfeeding means so much more than just like the food that it brings to a baby. I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay, 7 o'clock. So thinking about, the costs, we talked about the health so far, but then there's some additional costs to our communities when we don't have a lot of breastfeeding, right? And I do want to just say, like, there's always going to be folks that have problems with breastfeeding. That's something that we already talked about that at the very beginning. And really what we know, throughout history, because there's lots of story, there's folklore of, and lots of stories where like cross nursing or, community nursing is the norm in many of our tribal communities. And so, yes, there were always people that had problems with breastfeeding and challenges and maybe that couldn't breastfeed, but there was enough milk in the community to feed that baby. Right? That's where the aunties would come in and everyone else would take care of that baby and make sure that they had access to that milk medicine. And so we have these additional costs. So there's a monetary cost associated with not breastfeeding, right? So formula is expensive. I mean, bottom line is it's expensive. Even like generic brand, which is typically what I recommend, is still around $15 a can. And most families, especially in the first 6 months of a baby's life, are going to be needing between 8 and 10 cans of formula a month to feed their babies, right? So we're looking at about $200 a month just in direct cost to buy formula. That does not include additional costs of like missing work because baby is sick more often, health issues that maybe have additional costs, right? Diabetes is really expensive, right? Diabetes is really expensive. So there's kind of like these other costs, that indirect costs that we don't see. But when we look at families, and the direct impact of the cost of formula on families, is that an average middle class family in the United States can't afford a $400 emergency, right? The average middle class family in the United States cannot afford a $400 emergency. They would have to, anything above that, they'd have to put on a credit card or borrow money or something like that. I'm sure many of us completely empathize and have been in that, are in that position as well. And most families in the United States, especially our tribal communities, are taking unpaid time off to be with their babies after they're born, right? Because we don't have national paid leave. And many of our tribes don't offer paid leave. And especially if someone works for their tribe, they may not have access to state paid leave, things like that. Those are all, things that we need to consider. And so if they're already taking unpaid time off, then on top of that, throwing on this additional cost of this food, it can really, really, really add up. We do have supplemental programs like WIC, which is a federal supplemental program. It stands for Women, Infants, and Children, and it provides supplemental formula for families. But families are still going to have to buy between 2 and 3 cans of formula a month. And so for a family that qualifies for WIC, that is living in poverty, spending an additional $20 to $60 a month for formula can really like be the difference between being able to pay a bill or feed their baby, right? Like those are the decisions that families have to make. And so what a lot of times what families have to do is they actually meet in the middle and they stretch out the formula, right? So they water it down. They introduce foods that are not appropriate for the baby. They introduce other milks, things like that, that aren't appropriate for the baby. And that increases their risk of long-term health, health challenges too. So those are all things to think about. We also have, there's a significant cost to our society when we have low breastfeeding rates, which we've already talked about, that our Black and Indigenous communities will pay for a bulk of this burden. It's our communities that are disproportionately affected. So the cost, we share a disproportionate amount of the cost of not breastfeeding for our communities. We also have this environmental costs, right? Waste associated with formula. Are, typically in our tribal communities, the garbage that's made on the res stays on the res, right? It's not shipped off. Like yesterday was garbage day here in Seattle in my neighborhood, and they pick it up and I don't know where it goes, right? Like it goes somewhere, and I don't have to worry about it. But typically in our tribal communities, we have the dump, we have the landfill, right? And what garbage is made there stays there, and these cans will be there forever. Right? They're never going away. There's no such thing as a biodegradable formula can. And so, thinking about, again, like our breastfeeding rates, back to that second slide, times thousands and thousands and thousands of babies over hundreds of years, that adds up, right? Water usage as well. I don't think I need to go too far into like the impact or the water availability in many of our tribal communities and urban areas where a lot of Native families live. But I'll just say, which I'm sure you all know, is that water is not a commodity and it's not a guarantee. And clean water is not something that everyone in the US has access to, right? Up to 25% or 20% of homes on Indian reservations don't have running water to their homes. And so we really have to think about ethically what's happening when we send families home who don't even have running water, right? Or the ability to make the formula. What happens when we send them home formula feeding, right? Like that's an ethical issue that needs to be needs to be addressed as well. And then dairy production, we know that the dairy industry is just completely terrible for our environment, right? Like my girls like to, I don't know, I think my littlest was probably in like 2nd or 3rd grade when she told me, Mom, did you know that cows' farts put holes in the ozone, and she was like being funny and cute and like learned a weird, gross fact at school. And at the same time, like it's really gross to think about, right? The impact that the mass dairy production has. And formula companies are the #1 purchaser of dairy in the United States. So they use more dairy than any other product in the United States. Ice cream, everything, creamer, all of it. It's formula companies use the most. So it does have an environmental impact on us. And that disproportionately affects indigenous communities, right? Because it is our indigenous relatives in South America, in Brazil, whose traditional homelands have been completely desecrated to make room for cows, right? And this industry. So it has an impact on indigenous people everywhere. And then we have, this cultural cost, which I unfortunately probably won't get as much time to go into. But when we think about what makes up a culture, right? It's our spirituality, our land, our food, our language, and the matriarchy, right? Like that is really what makes up our cultures. And when we think about first contact and what, kind of Europeans, when they came to what we know of as Turtle Island, genocide was the goal, right? So it was just kind of like mass genocide and ending of life. And that didn't work, right? You're still here. Here we all are. We're here, talking and things like that. And so then they got, more, I don't know, thought of different ways, right? They're like, okay, so killing them all isn't going to work. What can we do? And then they started going after the culture, right? So first was our land and our food. Okay. Take the land, kill the buffalo, kill the fish, kill the game, everything so that we can't have access to our traditional foods and are dependent on our oppressor for these things, right? For living and for food. And then when that didn't work, they went after our spirituality, our language, and our matriarchy. And that's where we see boarding schools, in the 1830s, really, becoming a goal or the primary tool, one of the primary tools that the US government, in partnership with the Catholic Church, used to literally kill the Indian and save the man, right? That was the goal during that time. And so we had mass removal from the matriarchy, right? From the mothers, the culture, the storytellers, the life givers, the knowledge, right? The ones that bear the knowledge of the culture. And we took them away from their children and our food source. And that's really where we start to see this like mass loss of breastfeeding, right? Where we have like generations who weren't breastfed and weren't raised, right? Like weren't raised with that matriarchy. So I know we're getting close, so I want to keep my phone close. We're at 7:15. So thinking about, our barriers to breastfeeding and what we experience in the Native community, I'm not going to spend too much time because I want to leave time for questions at the end. But these are just some of the things that we see: poverty, lack of education. Lack of education does not refer to like book, college, that kind of stuff. Even though the higher education someone has, the more likely they are to be successful at breastfeeding. What I'm talking about when it comes to education is what we know about babies, right? Is that like in general, like a lot of us who have babies, when we have babies, we don't know a lot about babies, right? We don't know how they're going to act. We don't know what's normal. I find that a lot of times we pathologize normal and normalize pathology when it comes to babies, right? Kind of these expectations that like your baby should be sleeping through the night by a certain age. A good baby sleeps, right? Why does your baby want to be put down? Things like that. Those are all really normal things. It's not normal for a baby to sleep through the night well into their second year, right? Like if we just let them do their thing, they are easily 2 to 3 years old before they sleep at night and don't require someone to cuddle them back to sleep, right? So it's very abnormal to have that happen. But instead, we have an entire generation of parents for the last probably 50 years that's an expectation that they have of 2 to 4 month old infants, right? And you just can't, the way breastfeeding works is it's supply and demand. So we just can't sleep all night and expect to have milk to feed that baby, right? Like it just doesn't work that way. So a lot of times, like what we expect babies to do does not actually align with the biological design of how this all works. Lack of prenatal care, but the big one is lack of support. And that's the main one, you know, that I want to talk about before we end tonight, because that's where we fall under. So if we consider breastfeeding as a traditional practice, as a cultural practice, then it falls on the community to support that, right? It falls on us to maintain that and make sure that families are in a position to practice that traditional practice, right? It's our responsibility. So for significant others, our matriarchs, our healthcare providers, our lactation supporters, our community as a whole, it's our responsibility to make sure that families are in a position to breastfeed their babies, right? That they're cared for during this time, that teas are brought to them, that good food is brought to them, that they are, someone comes by and takes care of the house so that they can just lay in bed and nurse and experience that postpartum ceremony that would have been sacred to our ancestors, right? Like that would have been a protected time for at least 40 days where you would just lay in bed and connect and feed your baby, right? But we don't have a world like that anymore. And that's been something that we have, you know, we haven't just kind of lost this tradition of breastfeeding, but we've also lost this tradition of how to support new parents, right? And that culture and knowing how to help people. A lot of us, you know, it's very normal, I find, for when families come over to meet a new baby, is they think helping the new family is going to be removing the baby from the parents, you know. And that's like the last thing we want. Like we want to actually like do anything we can so that the parent and baby can stay together and you take care of other things for them, right? But that's, you know, that's something that we all have to work on reclaiming and relearning, and that, you know, learning how to say like, what can I help you with? Or I'm going to do some dishes, or, hey, before I leave, I'm going to clean your toilets. Okay. Where do you keep your stuff? You know, there's all sorts of different things we can do to support a family postpartum, so that they can just have their ceremony. Right. And we would do that for any other ceremony, right? Could you imagine if someone came in and tried to mess with a sweat, like how people would have protected that, right? Or Sundance. I mean, think like for folks that have been to a Sundance, could you imagine what happens if someone comes into that space with the intention of breaking up that ceremony, right? Yeah, like I just, you know, like you'd have all these people that, especially men would protect that space, right? Like that's what, like they would not let that happen. If someone came to Sundance on drugs or alcohol and was being belligerent, the men in that space would take over and they would protect that sacred ceremony, right? But when it comes to people who are postpartum, where are they? Right? Like how does that happen? But that's a shift. That's something we have to relearn. You know, it's no one's fault that we've forgotten how to do that. That was done to our communities. It's just a matter of like relearning it and understanding that it's our role. So with that, you know, just thinking about breastfeeding, you know, that it has the power to heal. I call it a weapon of mass construction, right? So we have Oxytocin is our love hormone. It's our warm, fuzzy feeling hormone. It's the one that makes us feel really, 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 really good. I just read a study yesterday that talked about how drumming, it's been proven that drumming actually increases oxytocin in people, right? Well, oxytocin is the hormone that makes our milk flow out of our bodies, right? So that's what releases those gates and the milk starts flowing. So oxytocin has a lot of healing components to it. We also see that parents who breastfeed are connected, they feel empowered and independent, and their babies feel empowered and independent. So there's so many good things that kind of come from that, and that we can heal and relearn those traditions and reclaim those traditions for our families. And so with that, I'll just leave it here with a little quote from Miss Annie Kahn, a Round Rock elder, who says, when a mother nurses her baby, she's giving that child her name, her story, and her life song. A nursed baby will grow to be strong in body, mind, and spirit. So yeah, here's my contact information, but I'd love to take any questions or comments if anyone has any.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How do you talk about like all these increased risks with like birthing parents who are expecting to breastfeed but for some reason can't or are limited in that way? Like, how do you do that without, like, how do you tell them these benefits or tell them the risks without alienating them further down?
Totally. I think, I find that one of the best ways is to like have early conversations, like before anyone is like super emotionally invested. Like I would never have a conversation with someone who is struggling with breastfeeding, they're mixed feeding, or maybe working on like ending breastfeeding, and be like, your baby's going to have an increased risk of SIDS now, right? Like I would not ever say anything like that, right? Like that ship has sailed. This is where it is. And that's okay, right? But kind of early on that there's, and I think you're one of the medical students, right? So, thinking about like when you're working with families and they find out they're pregnant, or even prenatally or like preconception, right? These are conversations that we really should be having in community about the importance of it before people are super emotionally invested in it, but, I think too, if you have someone who's pregnant and you kind of like, I always say, assume people are going to breastfeed. Like, we need to kind of, I find we need to shy away from kind of the language of like, are you going to breastfeed or are you going to formula feed, right? Like, again, one or two feeding choices. But kind of, saying like when I do our doula intakes, I always tell our families like, and we make sure breastfeeding's going well. And if there are any challenges, that's when I get called in, just kind of this assumption that you're going to breastfeed. And I expect that, I expect you to do that because I know that you super love your baby and you want what's best. And, so we're going to do that. And then if they're like, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to breastfeed, then I'll say like, tell me more about that. Let's talk, right? Like, let's have a conversation. Tell me more is my favorite thing. I think there's a couple of social work students and medical students on here, but that's what I always go to is, just like, tell me more, right? If I'm not getting anywhere, and then we can kind of learn what's going on, right? You might hear like, oh, well, the women in my family can't breastfeed. They've never been able to make enough milk. So I'm not, my mom told me not even to bother. And then I'll say, oh, that's really interesting. That's, we've learned a lot about breastfeeding over the last few years, and kind of like that's not an opening to drop some knowledge and explain kind of how it works and, things like that. So, or you can share, more of those risks and stuff like that. And then I think this is where like public health really comes in, is we need to have more public health messaging and campaigns where it's not necessarily up to providers to talk about the risk, but, also like, hey, there's posters, there's public health campaigns, there's, that kind of stuff. So it's normalized and in the community. But a lot of times too, like I'll do it, with families where I know they're at an increased risk, right? So I'll say, like, let's say you have someone who has gestational diabetes, or someone who smokes, right? Like, breastfeeding is so important for a family that smokes. Like, it's so protective. And so and usually they want to protect their baby, right? Usually they are wishing they could quit smoking or wishing they could do something different. And then that's when I'll say, like, I know it's so hard. Like, it's, really, really difficult. And you've done such a great job at reducing the number of cigarettes you smoke in a day. I really want to talk to you about how protective breastfeeding can be for your baby too, and protecting them from respiratory infections, SIDS, and the things that smoking puts your baby at an increased risk of, so yeah, that can be another thing.
Camie, can I say something?
Yeah.
As a mom of 4 who didn't get the connections early with, my kids, I would say, as a provider, something that I would tell you would be, give them that connection to a lactation consultant, because you're told in the hospital, breast is best, but then no one gives you any connection
right
from that point after you leave, and you feel lost. So just making those connections within the breastfeeding community so you can have those resources for them, so they're at more of a chance of being able to succeed.
Yes, so. Absolutely. Yeah, because we're really good in this country at telling people what they should do without giving them any support to achieve those things, right? So it's like you especially when it comes to parents, right? And moms, people who identify as moms, like, where it's like, you should stay home, but you shouldn't need public assistance. You should, right? There's like all sorts of different things. I mean, it's just back and forth. So yeah.
Thank you. I think that's what I get stressed about, is like, I feel like there's such a stigma with not being able to breastfeed. And then like parents can feel really like guilty. And then if there's already increased stress, then maybe that even hinders their ability to do it or whatever. So I just
totally,
I want to like support it without.
Yes.
And
I'll say too, like, this is, like, this might seem really crass to say, and so I apologize. But I find that kind of like, and it's not to say, I'll just like, quick disclaimer is, lots of Native parents and parents of color are very, very disappointed and feel really crappy when they don't meet their breastfeeding goals. Like, that does happen. I would have been devastated if I couldn't breastfeed after my second. My first, I wouldn't have cared because I knew nothing about it, right? And so I like had no, but like by the time I had my second, I was pretty hardcore, and I would have been just distraught, if I wasn't able to, or if I had problems that we couldn't solve, that kind of thing. But overall, like, I find that kind of like the extreme situations of guilt and shame tends to be a phenomena of white middle-class women. That like, when we work in communities of color, like, what ends up happening is we actually like withhold information from communities of color that can be like life-saving, because we don't want to make white moms feel bad, if that makes sense, right? Because they're kind of the ones that are centered in the conversations over and over again. And so like, I think you might find, as you get, just more and more comfortable in the community you serve, and more practice. And, it takes a long time. Like, I remember, like, I've been a social worker for over 15 years now, almost 20 years, which is bananas to think about how old I am. But like, I like my first couple years as a social worker, I was like, I didn't have kids. I didn't know anything. Right. And I'm here like working with parents. I don't know. I mean, it was just so funny. And so I probably made lots of mistakes in the way I said things, and did things. And then you get better and better and more confident and things like that. But what we see in the Black and Indigenous community more and more is that, kind of like what Tana's explaining, is that like, more often is information's withheld from us that can contribute to our success than the other way around. Does that make sense? You know, and so if we just are like, hey, and again, typically families that have chosen straight up to formula feed, or they don't want to breastfeed, they don't feel bad about it. They feel very confident in their decision. They've done their research. They know they know it. And so in those situations, say, okay, great, that kind of thing. Like, it's not really a convincing, a need to convince anyone of anything. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I had a question, whether or not like COVID impacted people's kind of decisions to breastfeed, or how that impacted like your practice, navigating that, information, research still coming out, everything.
Yes, I cannot wait for like our data to come out for the last 2 years. Like, we don't, I remember like when COVID first started, I was like, so many people are going to breastfeed. Like, this is, this is the time, like, where, we have a novel virus. We know, it was kind of funny, like the conversations of how long it took for the medical field to be like, it's okay to breastfeed, and for lactating parents to be with their baby. I mean, the first several months of the pandemic, they were separating babies and their parents, right? Who were presumed positive. Like, they weren't even, like guaranteed positive. And in fact, like, there was a huge like controversy with a hospital in Albuquerque, Lovelace Hospital, where they were presuming positive every family from a certain zip code, which happened to be on the Navajo reservation, because they had so many positive cases there that they just presumed any family from that area as positive and automatically routinely separated them from their babies, right? And so there was just like, and that took months, right? Months for kind of the medical system here to say like, oh, turns out COVID is like every other virus, and breastfeeding is important and protective. We're like, why would it ever be any different? So at first I really thought there was a couple of reasons why I thought breastfeeding was going to increase. We'd see an increase in rates. One is just people wanted to protect their babies, and make sure that they had those antibodies and things like that. So that was one area that I thought would happen. The other area that I thought would increase breastfeeding rates is that families were, I don't want to say isolated, like the community can be really supportive, and community can be really undermining, right? And so I kind of had this theory that if families, like we had all these families working from home, all these families, that were like with their babies, they didn't have like the nosy mother-in-law there, like pressuring them to bottle feed, right? Like all this stuff. And I was like, this is going to be great. Like, there's going to be a lot higher breastfeeding rates. 2 years in now, I don't think that's what we're going to see when this data comes out. So the breastfeeding report card comes out every summer. So usually in August, and that's like the national report card. And it's usually like 2 to 3 years behind, right? Like the data that they're reporting on is like 2 years ago data. So we should be getting the 2020 numbers out this year, hopefully, is like what we're going to be seeing. But I'm now like leaning toward we're probably not going to see that increase like I thought, because families were so isolated, and they were scared to have lactation consultants come over. Lactation consultants stopped doing home visits, and for a lot of families, families didn't want to go to hospitals for additional support because they were like COVID factories. And they just were home alone, right? Grandparents weren't coming, aunties weren't coming, no one was coming, no one was making food, no one was doing housework, right? Like no one did anything. And so I don't know where it's going to go, but I'm less hopeful that we're going to see an increase because of COVID the way I thought we were originally. You know, my N, right, or like the folks that I work with, and I travel like all over Indian country. I do a breastfeeding training that I forgot to mention at the beginning called Indigenous Breastfeeding Counselor. So it's a 5-day foundational breastfeeding training for peers. So people that become peer counselors and provide lactation support to their community. And it's for people that identify as Indigenous. And so I get to travel a lot to different tribal communities and things like that. But through my doula program and the families we serve, you know, it's not a very good, like, it's not a random selection, right? They have doulas. I run the doula program. Like there's a lot of reasons. So we have in my doula program 100% breastfeeding initiation rate. And most of our family, you know, and all of our families are Native, like, or Native Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian. And so we have 100% breastfeeding rate with our families, and we have very high exclusivity. I mean, we're like in the 90, you know, like 90+% exclusivity rate at 6 months, but our families are really, really, really socially protected, right? They have a doula. We work with them long-term. I do a home visit with all of our families within 1 week after they have their baby. If there's additional problems, I go out and see the family if the doula isn't able to provide the clinical support that they need. So there's different things that we do. So it's a little harder to really tell because I'm hearing stories and things like that. But like in our doula program, families rallied throughout this time. So I'm just not sure. It's a mystery. It's really, we're all waiting. Like the lactation nerds are like sitting on this seat, you know, the edge of our seats waiting for the data to come out to really find out.
Just
Thank you.
Time
a
for
quick thing before we head out.
Yeah.
Lindsey, did you want to share a little bit about the at-home test, the free at-home test that we have, and the KN95 masks?
Yeah, I do. But I think that Bronte actually had something that she wanted to come in and comment or question really quick, and then I will.
Yeah, I don't know if there's enough time, but I just had a question about, well, first, the work that you're doing sounds really awesome. And you're talking about peer counseling and the doula program, but what kind of community health information outreach distribution is most needed or missing? And what would you and where would you do that?
Ooh.
Great question.
So I don't know, like where, gosh, there's so much that's like missing. And then there's also so much going on. Like we're in such a great time right now when it comes to birth, you know, like birth reclamation and rematriation and all that's happening. It's just a really exciting time to be alive and to be an Indigenous and, you know, like get to experience all this. I'm part of a group called the Indigenous Milk Medicine Collective, and we put on Indigenous Milk Medicine Week, which was previously called Native Breastfeeding Week, and starts the second Saturday in the second Sunday in August until through Saturday. And that's a really, like, we have a Facebook group and an Instagram, and there's like a ton of really great information that, you know, then, which I think is like a really fun way to get information out there. And it's really like, visibility is like one of our primary goals. And so I think like telling stories is really important, you know, getting stories out about, you know, folks' breastfeeding experiences. And, you know, I would love to see more hyper local like messaging and things like that. Like if you're on, you know, the Blackfeet res, like highlight Blackfeet Native breastfeeding mom, you know, like Blackfeet breastfeeding moms, or, you know, like I went out to Seneca a couple years ago to teach my breastfeeding training, and like they had so many cool things. Like it was like every tribal building had a sticker on the door that said like breastfeeding welcome here. You know, Seneca Nation supports breastfeeding, breastfeed anytime, anywhere. They had different like posters around like the health center. You know, they had like a nursing pod that was available for someone if they wanted privacy. There's just, you know, different things that you can do. So I think that, and honestly, and I think Bronte, you were a medical student too, is that like really medical providers play a huge role in this. I mean, like I know a lot of the folks here, like first and second year medical students, but like research shows that medical students who are like pediatrics, OBGYN, or family practice, right? So working with babies, your average when it comes to breastfeeding education, when you graduate from school and start your practice, is 0. Like 0 hours of breastfeeding education, right? That's average. The average nurse is 3 hours, you know, but like that's who families come to you all for, that support and that education. And bottom line is like, I mean, as a lactation consultant, I see healthcare, like the healthcare system, healthcare providers, birth practices undermine breastfeeding time and time again. And so that is something that is like tangible that you can do, you know, of really, and I think you said in your intro, you want to, you know, OBG, like OB is in pediatrics is what you're interested in. And that's something that you can like really make sure that you know, might have to do a little extra and get some additional breastfeeding and lactation knowledge, but that would go a long way, right? To, as a provider, and that's something that you can talk to your school about and talk to your other, your, you know, student colleagues. And as you guys move into residency, like ask for more education when it comes to breastfeeding. Like I go to the Seattle Indian Health Board and teach the residents about breastfeeding, you know, like that kind of thing. And just be really, really vigilant about demanding that extra education. And if you can't get it through school, then do it on your own. It's worth your time to do it, you know, because it's the coolest stuff. Like it's so, breastfeeding's so cool. And like human milk is so cool. It's so exciting. So it's worth learning that, because the number of families that you will be able to help, the benefit will be seen for generations, right? Because again, it's a traditional practice. So for each family that reclaims a traditional practice, that changes the trajectory of their family, right? And the stories that they carry. So it is meaningful. Yeah. Apparently I did have it. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I think we're going to close out there. I wanted to make an announcement that anybody who's attending tonight, we would love to send you guys a gift. We have some at-home COVID test kits and some packages of masks that we can mail out to you if you email us at traditionalmedicine@connie.org with your mailing address. And you can let us know if we will send them out to you. Just send us the mailing address. We'll put you on the list. And as a thank you for joining us, we'd like to send that out. And then Camie, thank you so much for your presentation. It was absolutely amazing. I'm sure we could have gone on and on and on. And thank you for everybody's patience on us, the little hiccup getting started and then us running a little bit late because of that. I appreciate everybody kind of rolling with it there. And Camie, hopefully we'll have you on, you know, again in the future or do other presentations, because this was absolutely amazing. And then for the rest of you, keep a lookout for other events coming from the Connie's Traditional Medicine program. We'll be doing some spring harvesting events, some traditional medicine making events, some story sharing events, all sorts of different things coming up in the future. So go ahead and find us on Facebook, like us, follow us so that you can get notified of our events. We have most of you now on our email list so that I can send out emails of upcoming events. And I hope everybody has a great evening. Is there anything else you want to add, Camie, before we head out?
No, thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Camie, I just wanted I just want to say thank you for being here tonight. And I'm going to be contacting you soon. I'm starting to work on my capstone.